The paper tore clean down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot in the dead-silent morning air of Caldwell, Kansas, and every soul standing on the dusty main street of that town froze where they stood. Marshal Ralph Cooper held the two halves of the eviction notice in his hands, his jaw set like iron, his gray eyes blazing with a fury that the citizens of Caldwell had seen only twice before. Once when he disarmed 3 armed robbers with his bare hands, and once when a traveling land speculator had tried to bribe him with gold coin outside the jailhouse door. He let the pieces of paper fall from his fingers, and they tumbled on the October breeze like dead leaves, spinning past the polished boots of Helen Greer, land agent for the Continental Railway Development Consortium, whose face had gone the color of old tallow. "File that again," Ralph said, his voice low and absolutely level, the kind of quiet that was louder than thunder, "and see what happens." Helen Greer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Behind him, his 2 hired escorts, men in clean city coats who did not belong on the frontier, took a collective step backward. Standing on the porch of the small dry goods store that bore the painted sign ATWOOD Provisions, her hand pressed flat against the door frame as though she needed it to hold herself upright, Helen Atwood watched all of this happen and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight as a pocket watch spring for the last 6 weeks. She was 27 years old, a widow of 2 years, the sole provider for herself and the small business her late husband Daniel had built on this corner of Main Street. And until 40 seconds ago, she had believed that by nightfall she would be packing her life into a single wagon and driving out into the Kansas prairie with nowhere to go. The betrayal had come, as betrayals so often did, dressed up in legal language. The eviction notice had arrived by courier from the land office in Wichita 3 days prior, claiming that Atwood Provisions stood on land that had been surveyed and purchased by the Continental Railway Development Consortium as part of their planned expansion of the Caldwell Rail Depot, an expansion that, if it proceeded, would erase 6 businesses and 4 homes from the western side of Main Street to make room for a second switching yard and a company warehouse. The legal papers were precise, official-looking, and stamped with seals that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless. Helen had not been born small and powerless, and the years she'd spent building this business alongside Daniel had not made her so, but she was also not naive. She knew what money and lawyers could do to a woman alone in 1882. She had spent 3 sleepless nights reading those papers by lamplight, writing letters to the land office in Wichita that she knew might never be answered, and wondering who in this town might actually stand between her and the force that was coming for everything she'd built. She had not, in any version of that wondering, pictured Ralph Cooper. But then, she had not known Ralph Cooper very well at all until this morning. To understand how a careful, self-contained woman like Helen Atwood came to be standing on her porch, watching a federal marshal shred a legal document, and issue what amounted to a personal warning to a land agent backed by one of the most powerful railway companies in the American West, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the morning a stranger rode into Caldwell on a bay horse with trail dust on his coat and a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Helen had been sweeping the front step of her store on that September morning, the air carrying the first cool edge of autumn, when she heard the horse slow and stop at the hitching rail across the street near the jailhouse. She'd looked up because she always assessed strangers' habit built from 2 years of running a business alone, and she had noted a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with dark hair showing beneath a wide-brimmed hat, who sat in the saddle with the relaxed posture of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He'd swung down, looped his reins, and looked directly at her across the width of the street. She had looked away immediately, gone back to her sweeping, and thought nothing more about it. She had thought about it somewhat more the following day when the same man appeared in her store to purchase coffee, flour, and a box of rifle cartridges, and paid with correct coin without attempting to haggle, and thanked her without the speculative up-and-down look she'd come to expect from men who came into a business and found a woman running it alone. He'd introduced himself simply. Ralph Cooper, new territorial marshal assigned to Caldwell, replacing Amos Dale, who had retired to Missouri. "I know the store," he'd said, looking around at the organized shelves, the neat rows of canned goods, the carefully lettered price signs. "My predecessor spoke well of it. Said it was the best-stocked place between Wichita and the border." He was generous, Helen had said, and meant it. Amos Dale had been a decent man and a reliable customer. "I don't think he was exaggerating," Ralph had replied, and something in the simplicity of that observation, not flattery, just honest assessment, had made her look at him directly for the first time. He was, she had noted with the detached internal honesty she applied to most things, a handsome man, not in a showy way. His face was weathered. His nose had been broken at some point and had healed slightly crooked, and there was a scar along his left jaw that had the faded quality of an old story. But his eyes were the clear gray of river water in winter, and when they settled on you, they settled completely, without wandering or calculating. She'd found that unsettling in a way she couldn't precisely name. He'd come back to the store twice more in those first 2 weeks, purchasing supplies in the practical, unhurried way of a man who knew exactly what he needed. The second time, he'd stayed to ask her opinion on which of 2 brands of lamp oil burned cleaner, and she'd told him, and they'd had a 5-minute conversation about the practical economics of frontier provisioning that had been, she admitted to herself afterward, more genuinely interesting than most conversations she'd had in months. The third time, she'd been struggling to shift a delivery crate that was too heavy for her to manage alone, and he'd simply come through the door, picked up the other end without being asked, and helped her move it to the storeroom. "You don't have to do that," she'd said. "I know," he'd replied, and that had been the end of that. The eviction notice arrived on a Monday morning 3 weeks after Ralph Cooper had ridden into Caldwell, and Helen's world had divided cleanly into before and after. She'd read the document 3 times in a row, standing behind her counter, and had felt the specific cold weight of a threat that had been carefully designed to seem unanswerable. The Continental Railway Development Consortium had purchased the land under her store through a transaction conducted in Wichita, at the county land office, using a survey that Helen was almost certain contained deliberate inaccuracies about the western boundary line of the Main Street corridor. The purchase had been filed 2 months ago without notification to any of the affected property owners, which she suspected violated the terms of homestead protection under Kansas territorial law. But suspecting something and proving it were very different things, especially when the entity she was arguing against had lawyers in 3 cities and the ear of the territorial governor. She told herself she would handle it. She was good at handling things. She'd kept the store running through Daniel's illness, through his death, through 2 hard winters and a drought summer. She could handle this. She had handled it by writing letters, by visiting the land office in town, by consulting the county clerk, a timid man named Forsyth who clearly wished she would stop asking him questions, and by systematically compiling every piece of documentation she possessed about her ownership of the building and the land beneath it. What she found, buried in the original deed her late husband had filed in 1878, was a boundary description that directly contradicted the Railway Consortium survey. The original survey had placed her eastern lot line 18 feet closer to the street than the consortium's new survey showed, meaning their claim overlapped with legally deeded property. It was not airtight, but it was something. The question was what to do with something. The answer, though she hadn't known it yet, was Ralph Cooper. She'd gone to the jailhouse on a Thursday evening when the street was quieter and the likelihood of being seen and speculated about was lower. She'd knocked on the open door. He'd looked up from the desk where he'd been writing reports in a careful, deliberate hand, and he'd said, "Mrs. Atwood, come in." She'd laid the documents on his desk. She'd explained the situation completely, without softening it or dramatizing it, the way she explained everything with precision and without wasted words. She'd watched him read through the papers. He read carefully the way she did, going back to recheck things before moving forward. That had told her something about him. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The consortium survey is off," he said. "Anyone with fresh eyes can see it." "Yes," she said, "but they have the land office in Wichita cooperating with them, which means filing a correction is going to take time and legal resources I don't have." He looked at her steadily. "What do you need from me?" "I need to know whether you're willing to act as an independent witness when I challenge the survey at the county level. I need to know honestly whether that's something that falls within what you're prepared to do." She'd asked that last part because she was not a woman who leaned on people without asking first whether they were willing to be leaned on. She'd seen too many people make assumptions about others' goodwill and watch those assumptions collapse at the worst possible moment. Ralph had looked at the documents, then at her. "It falls within what I'm prepared to do," he said, "and a few things more if it comes to it." "I'm not asking for anything beyond legal action," she said quickly. "I know you're not," he said. "I wasn't offering anything beyond that. But the consortium has a way of escalating these things when they meet resistance, and I want you to know that when that happens, and it will, you won't be standing there alone." She had held his gaze for a moment, searching for the hidden motive, the angle, the favor that would be called in later. She found none. She gathered her papers and thanked him and went home and lay awake for a long time in the dark, thinking not about the consortium, but about the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd said you won't be standing there alone. She told herself it was simply the statement of a lawman doing his job. She believed that for approximately 4 more days. It was at the church social on the following Sunday that she began to suspect she'd been wrong about the nature of her own feelings. The church socials in Caldwell were community events, practical and lively, where women brought food and men brought their appetites, and the whole town gathered in the dust of the churchyard to exist together for an afternoon. Helen attended because not attending would draw more attention than attending, and because she genuinely liked several of the women whose company she found there, particularly Mee Birch, who ran the bakery, and Grace Tolliver, whose husband was the town doctor. Ralph had appeared at the edge of the churchyard in his off-duty coat, a plain dark wool garment that made him look less like a federal officer and more like an ordinary man, and someone, she suspected Mee Birch, who had opinions about everyone's social life, had steered him toward the table where Helen was standing. The conversation they'd had that afternoon was different from the conversations in the store or the jailhouse. It was less purposeful and more revealing, the way conversations become when there's no transaction driving them. She'd learned that he was from Colorado, from a ranch outside Pueblo that his father had built and his older brother now ran. That he'd gone into law enforcement at 22 after a string of cattle thefts had cost his father most of a season's income, and the local deputy had done nothing about it. That he'd spent 7 years as a deputy in various territorial postings before receiving his marshal's commission. That he had never married, though he said this without any particular self-pity, just as a fact. She told him, in return and without quite planning to, about meeting Daniel Atwood at a general store in Missouri when she was 22, and he was 24, about following him west to Caldwell with 3 trunks and more optimism than sense, about building the store from a single rented room into the business it was now, about the 2 years of loss that had followed Daniel's death, years she'd navigated by sheer force of will and a refusal to let grief become surrender. Ralph had listened to all of this with the complete, unhurried attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. When she finished, he hadn't offered sympathy or reassurance, which would have felt false. He'd said, "You built something real, that matters." 3 words, "You built something." She'd felt them settle in her chest with an accuracy that surprised her. It was not that she hadn't heard compliments before. It was that this one wasn't designed to soften or charm or maneuver. It was simply true, stated by someone who understood what building things cost and what it meant to protect what you'd made. Walking home from the social, She'd admitted to herself, in the private court of her own interior honesty, that she was developing feelings for Ralph Cooper that were not going to be convenient. She was in the middle of a serious legal battle. She had no time or space for complication. She also knew herself well enough to know that locking down an honest feeling and calling it inconvenient was exactly how you ended up making bad decisions, because suppressed things had a way of surfacing at the worst possible times. She decided, in her practical way, to simply acknowledge the feeling, monitor it, and keep it away from the situation at hand. That plan survived until the morning of October the 3rd, 1882. In the days before the confrontation on Main Street, the consortium had moved fast. They'd apparently decided that Helen's documented challenge to their survey was enough of a problem that they needed to force resolution before it could advance through official channels. Harlan Greer had appeared in Caldwell 2 days prior with his escorts and his attorney, a thin man named Whitfield who carried a leather satchel and spoke in the careful, confident tones of someone accustomed to being the most legally informed person in any room. They'd visited the land office. They'd met with the county clerk Forsyth, and whatever transpired in those meetings had clearly involved pressure that left Forsyth looking hunted every time Helen passed him on the street. On the morning of October the 3rd, a boy had appeared at her door at 7 in the morning with a sealed envelope, and the envelope had contained a new version of the eviction notice, refined, more precisely worded than the original, citing an emergency injunction filed that morning by Whitfield with the Wichita Land Court that purported to suspend Helen's ownership claim pending survey resolution, and ordering her to vacate the premises within 48 hours. She had read it standing in her doorway in the cold morning air. She had felt the specific quality of despair that comes when you have fought hard and correctly and discovered that the rules are being changed while the game is in progress. Then she had put on her coat, tucked the notice into her pocket, and walked to the jailhouse. Ralph had been at the desk again. He'd looked at her face when she came through the door and stood up immediately, which told her that whatever she was feeling was visible, and she was not someone whose feelings were usually visible. She'd handed him the notice without speaking. He'd read it and she'd watch the stillness come over him, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone who was making a decision, running through implications, arriving at a conclusion. His jaw tightened. His eyes cooled from gray to something closer to slate. "This injunction was filed in Wichita," he said. "This morning," she confirmed. "Before the land office here opened, before anyone could file a counterargument." "Whitfield worked through the night to get this ready," Ralph said. "They knew you were building a case. They're trying to cut off the process before it can develop." He set the paper down. "Did you know about the injunction filing?" "No," she said. "Which means Forsyth didn't warn me, even though he's seen my challenge documents, which means they got to him." "Or threatened him," Ralph said. He picked up the notice again and looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the desk, put it on, and said, "Come with me." She had followed him out of the jailhouse without asking where they were going, because there was something in his movement purposeful, direct, unhesitating, that told her he had decided on a course, and the moment for discussion about it was after, not before. Greer and Whitfield had been crossing the street from the hotel, heading toward the land office with their escorts, when Ralph and Helen had emerged from the jailhouse. The timing was almost theatrical. The street was populated with early morning Caldwell, the blacksmith carrying tools, 2 women from the milliner's sweeping their step, a farmer with a wagon of late-season corn stopped at the edge of the road to let his horse drink from the trough. Everyone had stopped to watch when Ralph Cooper had stepped directly into Harlan Greer's path. He'd asked, with perfect courtesy, to see the authorization for the emergency injunction. Whitfield had produced it from his satchel. Ralph had read it, and Helen, standing 2 steps behind him, had seen the moment he found what he was looking for: a slight tension in his shoulders, a brief pause in the movement of his eyes. "This injunction references a federal survey conducted in September," he said. The federal survey that was conducted here in September was the original boundary assessment under the Homestead Protection Act. It was never superseded by a private commission. The consortium's new survey is a private document. It carries no federal authority. Whitfield opened his mouth and Ralph said pleasantly, "I'm not finished." Whitfield closed his mouth. An emergency injunction filed against a homestead-protected property requires the signature of a federal circuit judge, Ralph continued. This document bears the signature of a territorial land commissioner. That's insufficient authority under the Homestead Protection Act of 1862. This injunction is procedurally invalid. There was a silence in which the October wind moved down Main Street, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Helen, watching this, had felt something bloom in her chest that she recognized with some surprise as pride. Not in herself. She had long since made peace with her own capabilities. This was pride in someone else's precision, someone else's preparation. He had known what to look for. He had known because he had done the research, because he had paid attention, because he had taken this matter as seriously as she had. Then he had reached out, taken the notice from Whitfield's hand and torn it in half. The pieces fell on the wind. The street was absolutely still. "File that again," Ralph said, his voice quiet and absolute, "and see what happens." Harlan Greer recovered first, which told Helen something about his character, not courage exactly, but the persistence of a man accustomed to pushing through obstacles. "Marshal," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "you have no authority to invalidate a document filed with the Territorial Land Office. That decision belongs to the courts." "You're right," Ralph said. "It does, and I look forward to the courts examining the discrepancy between your private survey and the federal survey on file in the homestead records. I also look forward to the courts examining how your purchase of this land was filed in Wichita 2 months ago without notification to the affected property holders, which is a violation of Section 14 of the Kansas Territorial Property Code." He paused. "Would you like me to go on?" Greer and Whitfield exchanged a look. The escorts shifted their weight. Helen pressed her hand against the door frame of her store and breathed. "We will pursue this through proper legal channels," Whitfield said, in the tone of a man retreating while attempting to look as though he was not retreating. "Good," Ralph said. "I'll be watching those channels." And that was that, for that morning at least. They walked back to the jailhouse together, Helen and Ralph, and went inside, and he closed the door, and she sat down in the chair across from his desk because her legs had decided, apparently, that they had done enough for one morning. She looked at her hands in her lap and then she looked at him and said, "You researched all of that?" "Yes," he said. "When did you do that?" "The night after you showed me the original eviction notice. I wrote to the Federal Land Office in Topeka for the original homestead survey records. They came in yesterday." He sat down across from her. "I was going to tell you this morning. Then the new notice arrived and I decided showing you was more useful than telling you." She held his gaze. "You spent your own time on this. You asked for my help. I asked you to be a witness," she said, "not to do independent legal research." "The situation called for more than a witness," he said. "I'm not sorry about that." There was a long pause. Outside, she could hear Caldwell resuming its mourning, the sound of the wagon moving again, the distant clang from the blacksmith's shop, someone calling a name across the street. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went beyond the practical situation which she suspected they both knew. "You don't have to," he said, "but I should tell you this isn't over. Greer is going to file through the proper courts. He has lawyers and money and political connections. The legal fight is going to take months and it's going to be difficult. The torn notice was today. The court battle is everything that comes after." "I know," she said. "I've known since the beginning." He looked at her for a moment in the quiet of the jailhouse. "I know you have," he said. She went back to her store and opened it for business, because keeping the store open was the best possible statement she could make to the consortium about the nature of her resistance. Customers came in throughout the morning. Several of them had witnessed the scene on Main Street, and word had traveled, and Helen was aware that the town was now watching this situation with the heightened attention it gave to matters of justice and contest. Birch came in at mid-morning under the pretext of buying baking soda and actually to say, with considerable warmth, "Ralph Cooper is a good man. I knew it when he first came to town." Helen measured out the baking soda and said, "He's an effective marshal." Gave her a look that expressed, without words, an entire opinion on the distinction between those two statements and went back to her bakery. The days that followed were a complicated dance of legal process and personal revelation. Ralph, true to his word, remained present in the developing legal challenge to the consortium's claims. He communicated with the Federal Land Office in Topeka, providing a sworn statement about the discrepancy between the private survey and the federal homestead records. He connected Helen with a lawyer in Wichita, a man named Edward Harks who had successfully challenged railway land acquisitions twice before, whose services he apparently arranged through a contact from his previous posting. But beyond the legal work, he showed up. Not in ways that were obvious or intrusive or that could be called anything other than practical. He stopped by the store each morning to check in. He walked her to the land office when she needed to file documents. He was present at the meetings with Harks when that man came to Caldwell in mid-October, and he asked the kinds of precise, difficult questions that a lawyer appreciates because they reveal that someone has actually read the brief. Helen watched all of this and tried not to read into it. She failed. She failed specifically on the evening of October the 15th, when she was working late in the store balancing her accounts and heard a knock at the locked front door. She opened it to find Ralph standing there with a paper-wrapped parcel and an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that suggested it was taking some effort. "I was at the restaurant," he said. "Mrs. Galloway had extra lamb stew. I thought you might not have eaten." She had not eaten. She'd been intending to. She took the parcel, and then, because it was cold and his breath was visible in the night air, and she had been running the numbers that suggested this legal fight was going to cost her significantly more than she had in reserve, she said, "Come in. I'll make coffee." He came in, and she made coffee on the small stove in the back room, and they ate lamb stew from the parcel and drank coffee and talked. Not about the case, which was notable. They talked about everything else, about the peculiarities of Caldwell's social hierarchy, about whether the new rail expansion, if it came to other parts of town, would ultimately help or hurt the small businesses that depended on both the cattle trade and the growing settlement population. About Colorado, which she had never seen but which he described with a specificity that made her feel she could almost picture the mountains. About Missouri, where she had grown up, which he had passed through once on his way to a posting in Indian Territory. They talked until the stove had burned down to coals and the lamplight was guttering, and then she looked up at the clock on the wall and realized it was past 10 o'clock and felt a small shock of surprise, because she could not remember the last time she had been so entirely absorbed in a conversation that time had simply ceased to be a factor. He noticed her look at the clock. "I've kept you too long," he said, standing. "No," she said immediately, and then, because that had been too quick and too revealing, she added more calmly, "I've lost track of the time. That doesn't happen to me often." He looked at her. "Me either," he said. She walked him to the door. He put on his hat. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight with an expression that was serious and direct, and she thought she was almost sure that he was about to say something. Then his expression shifted into the careful neutrality, and he said, "I'll be at the land office at 8 tomorrow for the filing. I'll meet you there." "Yes," she said. "Good night, Marshal." "Good night, Mrs. Atwood," he said, and went out into the dark. She stood in the closed store and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and admitted, in the absolute privacy of the empty room, that she was thoroughly in love with Ralph Cooper, and that this was, from a purely logistical standpoint, a significant problem. The problem was not the feeling itself. Feelings, in her experience, were neither problems nor solutions. They were facts to be understood and worked with. The problem was timing and position. She was in the middle of a legal battle that required her to be entirely clear-headed and strategically focused. She was a woman in a town where her reputation for independence and competence was both her greatest professional asset and something that could be complicated by any perception of personal entanglement. And Ralph was the marshal who was helping her fight that battle, which meant that any suggestion of something more personal between them could be used, and Greer and Whitfield would certainly use it to undermine the legitimacy of his involvement. She decided, again, to hold the feeling back and deal with the situation first. She managed this for approximately 2 more weeks. The legal proceedings were moving. Edward Harks had filed a formal challenge to the consortium's survey in Wichita and had petitioned for a federal review of the original homestead boundary documentation. The consortium's lawyers had responded with a counterfiling that attempted to reframe the entire dispute as a question of commercial development interest versus private property, a framing that was legally questionable but politically effective, because the railway companies had enormous influence over the territorial legislature, and the territorial legislature had enormous influence over the courts. Ralph had gone to Topeka in the 3rd week of October to present the federal survey discrepancy in person to the land office, because he determined that written communication was too slow and too easily buried. He'd been gone for 4 days. Helen had been fine with this in all practical respects, and had been entirely unable to stop noticing his absence in ways that had nothing to do with the legal situation. He came back on a Wednesday morning with a sworn federal statement confirming the discrepancy, and with a telegram from the office of the Secretary of the Interior indicating that the matter would be reviewed at the federal level. It was not a victory, but it was the kind of development that changed the landscape, because the consortium could overwhelm a territorial dispute, but a federal review was a different creature entirely, one that carried the kind of scrutiny that even railway companies with political connections preferred to avoid. Helen was in the store when he came back. He came through the door with the trail dust still on him, hat in hand, and laid the federal statement and the telegram on the counter in front of her. She read them. She looked up at him, and she said with absolute precision and no dramatization, "You did it." "Harks did most of it," he said. "I just made sure the right people heard the right information." "That's more than most people do," she said. He looked at her across the counter. She looked at him. The store was empty except for the 2 of them and the October light coming through the windows. Outside, a cart rattled down the street and someone called a greeting to someone else, and inside there was a quality of silence that was different from ordinary silence, charged, like the air before a lightning storm. "Helen," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something precise and specific to her composure. "Ralph," she said. He exhaled slowly. "I realize this is not the moment for this," he said, "and if you prefer I not say anything until the legal situation is resolved, I will respect that entirely. But I think you should know that my involvement in your situation is not purely, that it has become." He stopped and looked at the hat in his hands, and she realized with a warmth that spread through her from the inside that this controlled, capable man was struggling for words. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Yes." "Yes, I know," she said. "And yes, it's mutual. And yes, I think we should probably wait until this is resolved because anything else right now creates complications that neither of us needs. But I wanted to answer the question before you finished asking it because I didn't want you to spend a night wondering." He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way she was learning to recognize as his version of a significant smile. "That's the most sensible thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I'm generally a sensible person," she said, and was aware that she was smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in a very long time. "You are," he agreed. "It's one of the things I find most," he considered the word, "compelling." She turned back to the documents on her counter before she said something that contradicted her own argument about waiting. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. Thank you," he said, "for coming to my office that night, for trusting me with it." He left shortly after to file reports and send telegrams, and she stood behind her counter and felt, alongside the warm certainty of the feeling itself, a clean and settled kind of hope that she had not expected to feel again. The resolution came in stages rather than in a single dramatic moment, which was how most real conflicts resolved, not in a decisive battle, but in a gradual collapse of the opponent's position under the weight of sustained, accurate pressure. Hark's challenge in Wichita was heard at the end of October by a circuit court judge named Alderman, who was known to be skeptical of railway land consolidations and who took the Federal Survey discrepancy with the seriousness it deserved. Whitfield argued brilliantly for the consortium's position, and there were several days of genuine uncertainty during which Helen spent her evenings going over documents and her mornings opening her store with the deliberate normalcy of someone refusing to yield to fear. Ralph was present throughout. At the court hearings in Wichita, which required a 2-day journey each way, and which Helen attended alongside Harks and Ralph, staying at the commercial hotel on Commerce Street with her savings taking the hit of the cost. She and Ralph rode to Wichita in the same rented stage coach with Harks, and the hours of that journey, going and coming back, were hours in which she learned more about him, about the way his mind worked when problems were examined at length, about his quiet humor, about the particular quality of his attentiveness that made whatever she said feel like the most important thing in the room. On the return journey from the second Wichita hearing, in the closing stages of what had been a long and exhausting week, she had fallen asleep against his shoulder in the coach, not intentionally, simply because she had been awake since 4 that morning and the rhythm of the wheels was relentless, and had woken an hour later to find that he had not moved, that his shoulder was still precisely where she'd left it, and that his hand had come to rest with careful deliberateness against hers on the seat between them. She had not moved either. They traveled the remaining miles to Caldwell like that, and neither of them had mentioned it when they arrived, but something between them had shifted into a territory that was past speaking about and past needing to be spoken about. Judge Alderman issued his ruling on the 5th of November, 1882. The Continental Railway Development Consortium's private survey was determined to be inaccurate by 19 feet at the critical eastern boundary, a discrepancy sufficient to render their purchase of the western Main Street corridor legally void under the original homestead filing. Their emergency injunction was formally invalidated. Their land purchase claim against the 6 affected properties was dismissed. The consortium could appeal, but Harks assessed the chances of a successful appeal as extremely low, given that the Federal Survey records were definitive. Helen received the news by telegram at the store on a Friday morning. She read it 3 times. Then she put it in her apron pocket and served the 3 customers waiting at her counter and watched them leave and stood alone in the store and allowed herself, privately and thoroughly, to feel the relief and the triumph of it. Ralph came in 20 minutes later. He had obviously already heard someone in Caldwell always heard the telegrams, and he came through the door and looked at her and she looked at him and she said, "We won." "Yes," he said. "Because of you," she said. "Because of both of us," he said. "You built the case. You held your ground. You kept the store open through all of it." She came out from behind the counter. It was something she never did during business hours. She crossed the floor to where he was standing and she looked up at him and she said, with the same precision she applied to everything, "I believe the legal situation is now resolved." He understood her immediately, because he was that kind of man. His expression opened in a way she hadn't seen before, something unguarded and warm and entirely undefended, and he said quietly, "It is." "Good," she said. He took her hand in his and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep, and she felt the solid reality of it, the warmth and the weight of his hand around hers, and she thought, this is what it means to build something real. What followed was not the dramatic rush of a feeling newly uncovered, but the steady deepening of something that had already been built, layer by layer, through the weeks of shared purpose and honest conversation and the particular intimacy of fighting something difficult together. They began spending evenings together with the deliberateness of two people who have decided, having assessed all the facts, to proceed. He came to the store after closing, and they talked through the door while she finished her accounts, and then they walked together through the town in the cold November air. And the conversations they had on those walks were the best conversations she had ever had, wide-ranging, honest, punctuated by a shared sense of humor that had emerged gradually and felt like discovering a room in a house you thought you knew. He told her about the dark past of his early years as a deputy, the posting in Indian Territory where he'd been caught in the middle of a land dispute that had turned violent, where he'd made a choice to protect a group of displaced settlers that had cost him his position, and won him the respect of his superiors and a permanent weight in his chest that he carried carefully. He had worked for 3 years after that to rebuild his standing in the service, driven by the belief that law, properly applied, was the only thing standing between ordinary people and the raw power of those who thought money entitled them to anything. She told him about the secrets she had kept from Daniel in his final months, not betrayals but protections. She had known the store's finances were worse than she'd let him believe, and had worked through nights to correct the trajectory before he discovered it, because he had worried so much in those last months, and she had wanted more than anything to give him peace. She had succeeded. He had died believing the store was secure. She had made it so after. Ralph listened to this without offering comfort or absolution, both of which would have been presumptuous. He said, "You gave him something real in those last months." She thought that might be the most honest thing anyone had said to her about that time. December arrived, and with it, the kind of Kansas cold that demanded serious coat and serious firewood, and the town of Caldwell settled into its winter rhythms, and the Continental Railway Development Consortium, apparently having decided that Caldwell's western Main Street was more trouble than it was worth, shifted their expansion plans to a different site south of town that did not involve displacing existing property owners. Harlan Greer departed on the southbound stage in early December and was not seen again in Caldwell. Whitfield sent a single formal letter to Harks confirming the withdrawal of all claims. Harks wrote to Helen to tell her it was definitively over. She framed the letter. Not the legal documents, those went into the strongbox under the counter. The letter she framed and hung on the wall behind her cash register, because it was, she had decided, a document worth looking at. Ralph came into the store on the evening of the 16th of December to find her hanging the frame and stood behind her holding the hammer she'd set down while she adjusted the angle. And when she stepped back to assess the placement, she stepped back directly into him, which she had not planned, and he put his free hand on her shoulder to steady her, which she had not expected, and they stood like that for a moment, her back against his chest, his chin near her temple, looking at the framed letter on the wall. "Straight?" she asked. "Perfectly straight," he said, his voice close to her ear. She turned, which meant she was facing him very directly in a very small amount of space, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and the hammer was still in his hand, and she reached up and took it from him, set it on the counter and said, "I would like to say something." "All right," he said. "I am not someone who says things I don't mean," she said. "You know that." "I know that," he confirmed. "So when I say that these last 3 months have been the most significant months I can remember in a long time, I want you to understand that I mean that precisely and not generally." He was very still. "I understand. And I want you to know," she continued, because she had started and stopping would be cowardly and she had never been a coward, "that I am not interested in a cautious or provisional version of whatever this is between us. I have done things cautiously and provisionally when caution was called for. I don't think caution is called for now. A long beat of silence. Then, "What do you think is called for?" "Something honest," she said, "and something lasting if you want it to be." He reached up and touched her face with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, careful, certain, unhurried, and said, "Helen, I came to Caldwell on a routine posting assignment, and I found something I wasn't expecting. I would like very much for it to be lasting." She kissed him first, which felt right, because she had initiated most of the important decisions in her life, and she saw no reason to change that pattern now. He kissed her back with a thoroughness that told her everything she needed to know about the depth of what he'd been holding carefully in check for 3 months. And they stood in the warm lamplight of Atwood Provisions, with the framed letter of victory on the wall and the winter dark outside, and the town of Caldwell going about its evening around them. And she thought for the second time in her life, and with the full knowledge of what it had cost the first time and what it would ask of her again. This is the right thing. Christmas in Caldwell in 1882 was cold and clear and smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of Mee Birch's holiday baking, which reached across half the street and pulled people toward the bakery like a tide. Helen decorated the store with practical cheer, a wreath on the door, a string of paper ornaments across the window, a small display of gift-appropriate goods near the entrance, and found that this December felt genuinely festive in a way that the previous two had not, because grief, she was learning, did not end, but it did, eventually, step aside and make room for other things. She and Ralph spent Christmas Eve at the church service, and then at his small rented house near the jailhouse, where he had made an effort that she found deeply endearing: a fire properly banked, coffee on, a meal that was genuinely good if not elegant, because it turned out he could cook in the practical, competent way he did most things. They sat at his small table and ate and talked, and the evening felt like a blueprint of something she wanted many more instances of. "Will you stay in Caldwell?" she asked. "When your posting ends." He looked at her across the table. "Where else would I be?" he said. "Your commission could be renewed in another location," she said. "You could be transferred." "I could request a permanent posting in Caldwell," he said. "I've already written the request." She processed this. "When did you write it?" "October," he said. "After the eviction notice, after I'd started to understand what was here." "You started writing a permanent posting request in October?" "Yes." "That was," she calculated, "approximately 6 weeks after you arrived." "Yes," he said, without apology or embarrassment. She looked at him steadily. "You were certain that quickly?" "I was clear that quickly," he said. Certainty came somewhat later. She felt the warmth of that distinction. "When?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, which was how he thought about everything. "The night at the jailhouse," he said, "when you laid the documents on my desk and explained the situation without any dramatization or appeal for sympathy, just the facts and the problem and an honest question about whether I was willing. I thought, that's someone worth knowing well." She held that for a moment. "I thought the same thing about you," she said, "when you helped me move the crate in the storeroom and didn't make anything of it." He smiled, the real, full version that she had by now seen enough times to know it was significant. "We were both paying attention from early on." "We were," she agreed. "Though I'd like it noted that I was paying attention in a strictly practical capacity." "Noted," he said, entirely seriously. She laughed, which was something she did more of now, and he watched her laugh with the specific expression she had stopped trying not to notice, open and warm and thoroughly gone on her, which was precisely how she felt about him. The new year came in with wind and stars, and January 1883 settled over the Kansas plain with its gray weight. Business in the store was slower in the deep of winter, as it always was, and Helen used the quieter hours to reorganize her accounts and her stock strategy, preparing for the spring surge that would come with the new wave of settlers and cattle operations that Caldwell's growing reputation as a stable, lawful town attracted each year. Ralph's permanent posting request was approved in February, which meant she stopped calculating the end date of his assignment. She celebrated this privately, because she was not a woman who made a production of things, but he caught her expression when she heard the news and said, "Good," and she said, Yes, and that was a complete and satisfying conversation. It was in March, with the first tentative edge of warmth returning to the mornings and the mud season beginning its annual assault on the streets of Caldwell, that Ralph Cooper came into the store on a Thursday afternoon when there were no customers and placed something on the counter that was small enough to sit in the center of his palm. It was a ring. A simple gold band with a single small garnet set in plain gold prongs, not elaborate, not showy, exactly suited to a woman who valued the substantial over the decorative. "I thought about the speech," he said. "The formal version, I wrote 3 drafts of it." She looked at the ring and then at him. "What happened to the drafts?" "They were all too long," he said, "and not honest enough. So I'm just going to say it simply. Helen, I want to marry you. I want this to be permanent. I want to spend the rest of my life next to yours. And I want to ask rather than assume, even though I think I know your answer, because you're a woman who deserves to be asked." She picked up the ring. She looked at it for a moment, the clean simplicity of it, the quiet rightness of it. Then she put it on her finger. It fit perfectly, which she would ask him about later and discover that he had noticed over the course of 3 months that her ring finger was a precise size and had, with characteristic preparation, taken that measurement into account. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He came around the counter, which nobody was supposed to do except her, and kissed her with the thoroughness that was entirely characteristic of him. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was quite a lot. They were married in April, when the Kansas spring had turned the grass on the plain green, and the wildflowers were coming in along the creek road east of town, in a ceremony at the Caldwell Church that was attended by essentially everyone in town, because word had traveled, as it always did, and the general consensus was that this was the best possible outcome of what had begun as a very worrying situation with that railway consortium business. Me Birch made a wedding cake that was, by universal agreement, exceptional. Grace Tolliver cried, which she had predicted she would do. Edward Harkes, the Wichita lawyer, came down for the ceremony because he had become genuinely fond of both of them through the legal proceedings, and said it was the best case he had ever worked on, not because of the law involved but because of the people. Helen wore a dress that was not white. White was impractical, and she was a practical woman, but a deep blue that brought out the color in her eyes, and Ralph wore his good suit and his marshal's badge and had, she noticed with great affection, polished his boots to a degree that suggested significant effort. She walked up the aisle of that small church on her own, because she was her own person and had been for some time, and she looked at Ralph standing at the front and thought, with the clear-eyed honesty that was her most fundamental characteristic, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The minister's words were traditional, and she meant every vowel, saying them with the same precision she brought to documents and accounts and conversations that mattered. Ralph said his with the quiet certainty that was the most characteristic thing about him, looking at her directly throughout with his gray eyes completely focused, and she thought that this was the best possible quality in a person, this capacity for complete presence, for total attention to the thing that mattered most in the moment. When he kissed her at the end and the church applauded and Me Birch produced a handkerchief, she felt, with the particular quality of grace that only comes after real difficulty, that the thing she had fought for and the thing she had found were both fully, finally, and unreservedly hers. Life in Caldwell continued its rhythms into the spring and summer of 1883, and life in the Cooper household, which was now both Ralph's rented house and the back rooms of the store, which they decided together to convert into proper living space above the business, a project that took 2 months of evenings and weekends and several arguments about the placement of the kitchen stove that they resolved with the good-natured compromise of people who fundamentally respect each other's judgment. Became its own particular rhythm. Helen kept the store, which continued to grow with the town. Ralph kept the peace, which in Caldwell involved more paperwork and negotiation than gunplay, for which she was grateful, because the Wild West of the popular imagination was somewhat more dramatic than the daily reality of a well-managed cattle town, and she had no desire to spend her evenings worrying about her husband in the way that Marshall's wives in the dime novels always seemed to. He was shot at once that summer, by a drunk cattle hand who was a bad aim and whose bullet took out the jailhouse window, rather than anything more significant. Helen's response to being told about this was to go to the jailhouse, assess that Ralph was uninjured, look at the broken window, and say, "You'll need to requisition new glass." Ralph had looked at her with such complete appreciation that she had laughed. "Were you expecting something more dramatic from me?" she'd asked. "I didn't know what to expect," he said honestly. "I think I was expecting at least some alarm." "I was alarmed," she said. "I assessed the situation, determined the alarm was no longer necessary, and moved on to the next practical matter. That's how I handle things." "I know that," he said, and the warmth in his voice made it clear that this was not a criticism. "Though," she added, touching his arm briefly in the particular way she had developed for conveying large things in small gestures, "I am very glad your window has poor aim." By autumn of 1883, a year after the October morning that had torn an eviction notice and changed everything, Helen realized she was expecting a child. She told Ralph on a Sunday morning over coffee, seated at their kitchen table in the living space above the store, with the Kansas autumn light coming through the window and the sounds of the town beginning its day below them. He received the news with the same quality of complete presence he brought to everything, absorbing it fully, going quiet for a moment while he processed it, and then reaching across the table and taking her hand with such care and such happiness that she felt her throat close in a way that she hadn't expected. "Are you all right?" he asked, because that was the first question he asked. "Yes," she said, "perfectly well. A little tired in the mornings. Dr. Tolliver confirmed it last week." "You've known for a week." "I wanted to be certain before I said anything," she said. "I don't make announcements until I'm certain." He shook his head with the private smile she loved most, the one that was specifically for her. "Of course you don't," he said. She looked at him across their kitchen table. With the morning light on his face and the happiness she could see he was working to contain, because he was a man who held large feelings carefully. And she thought of the October morning a year ago, when she had pressed her hand against the door frame of her store, and watched a man tear an eviction notice in half and say something that had, without her knowing it yet, begun the sequence of events that had brought her to this kitchen table on this morning with this person. "Are you happy?" she asked, because even with everything she knew about him she wanted to hear it said. "Yes," he said, with the simple, direct honesty that was his most fundamental quality. "Completely." "Good," she said, and squeezed his hand and turned back to her coffee. Their son was born in May of 1884, in the warmth of a Kansas spring, delivered by Dr. Tolliver with competence and Grace Tolliver's assistance, and Ralph, in the next room doing his best to be useful in a situation where his most useful contribution was, ultimately, to stay out of the way and trust the process. Helen had the child with the same determined, precise approach she brought to difficult situations, focused effort. No wasted energy, clear outcome. And when it was done and she was holding the boy, with his dark hair that was already clearly his father's and his furious, wide-awake eyes looking at the world as if it owed him an explanation, she felt a satisfaction that was so complete it was almost like silence. Ralph came in when the doctor gave the all-clear and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that Helen had never seen on his face before and immediately recognized as the particular openness of a man encountering something that has undone all his defenses without warning. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like he has opinions," Ralph said. "He comes by that honestly," she said, and Ralph looked at her with such complete warmth that she had to look away before she started crying, which she was not, in general, someone who did. They named him James, after Ralph's father, with Daniel as his middle name, because Helen thought that was the right way to honor what had come before without making the past larger than the present. James Cooper was, from his earliest days, a person with strong convictions about food and sleep and the general arrangement of the world, which his parents found both exhausting and magnificent. He grew with the particular vigor of a child who is deeply loved and given room to grow, in a household above a thriving store in a town that was itself building into something more permanent and real with every passing season. Caldwell in the mid-1880s was a town finding its settled character. The wilder edges of the cattle trade were giving way to the more complex business of permanent settlement, of schools and churches and civic argument, and the slow accumulation of shared history. Ralph's work evolved with it, from the rougher justice of early frontier law toward the more nuanced business of a town with courts and ordinances, and a citizenry that expected the law to be an instrument of genuine fairness, rather than just a restraint on violence. He was, Helen observed, very good at this version of the job as well, the patient work of maintaining order in a community of people with competing interests and strong opinions. He was respected in a way that had nothing to do with fear, which she thought was the best thing a lawman could aspire to. She was respected in similar ways. Atwood Provisions had grown, through the years since the consortium battle, into one of the most well-regarded businesses in the region, not only for the quality of its goods, but for the fairness of its pricing and the reliability of its proprietress's word. When a deal was made with Helen Cooper, it was kept. When she said a product was what she claimed, it was exactly that. Her reputation was built on the same foundation she'd always built on: precision, honesty, and the consistent refusal to take shortcuts. 3 years after James, in 1887, their daughter was born, Catherine, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother, and immediately demonstrated an interest in everything around her that suggested a similarly organized intelligence applied to wider territory. Helen and Ralph watched their children grow in the way that parents who have both had to fight for things tend to watch the people they are protecting, with attentiveness and with deep gratitude, and with the specific determination to build something around them that would hold. The town remembered the story of the eviction notice, as towns remember the stories that defined moments in their character. It became one of those founding narratives that got told at socials and mentioned in retrospective conversations about what Caldwell was, and what it stood for. The story of the time. The Railway Consortium had tried to take 6 businesses off Main Street with fraudulent surveys and bought-off officials, and a woman had refused to go, and the marshal had torn up their paper in the street and told them to try again if they dared, and they hadn't dared. Helen, when people brought the story up in her presence, always said the same thing: the paper tearing was Ralph's contribution, the legal research was mine. Ralph, when people brought it up in his presence, always said, "Helen built the case. I just made sure it was heard." Both of these things were true, and both of them said what needed to be said about the people involved. On an October morning in 1888, exactly 6 years after the original confrontation on Main Street, Helen was behind the counter of Atwood Provisions. The store was larger now, having taken over the adjacent space when the shoemaker retired. When Ralph came in through the front door in the unhurried way he had of appearing in the middle of her working day, as if she was always the direction he naturally moved in. James, who was 4 years old and had opinions about being left in the care of the neighbor woman who sometimes watched the children, had apparently managed to follow his father down Main Street, and was now standing in the store doorway with the profound satisfaction of a person who has succeeded at a mission he had no authorization to undertake. "James," Helen said. "He got out when I came in," Ralph said, not quite successfully concealing his amusement. "I see that." "I told him he was coming back to Mrs. Peterson," Ralph said. "I told him too," said James, in the tone of someone quoting himself approvingly. "I said I was going to see Mama." Helen looked at her son, the dark hair, the wide gray eyes that were his father's eyes in miniature, the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has decided the world will arrange itself around his wishes, and felt the particular helpless love that was nothing like any other feeling she had, a love that was physical and fierce and entirely beyond argument. "Come here, then," she said, and he came through the counter gate and stood next to her, looking with great seriousness at the items on the shelves, and she went back to her accounting. Ralph leaned against the counter and watched the two of them, and something in his expression was so undefended that she glanced at him and said quietly, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to come by." "You wanted to come by," she repeated. "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "You walked a quarter-mile off your route to come by my store in the middle of your shift." "I did," he confirmed. "Why?" He looked at her across the counter with his clear gray eyes and said, with the simple directness that was the most Ralph Cooper thing about him, "Because it's where I want to be." She held his gaze for a long moment. James was arranging some small items on the lower shelf with the intense focus of a child who has decided this is important work. The store smelled of coffee and lamp oil, and the particular clean smell of new goods carefully stored. Outside, Main Street was doing its ordinary business, horses and wagons, and the voices of people who lived their lives in this place they had built together. She thought about a woman standing in a doorway 6 years ago watching a man make a choice that changed everything, about sleepless nights over legal documents, and the specific quality of relief when an ally proved real, about lamb stew shared on a cold October evening, and the sound of a telegram arriving that said, "We won," and a ring set on a counter, and all the seasons that had come after, the fights and the compromises and the children and the ordinary. Extraordinary evenings in their kitchen with coffee going cold, because they'd talked too long about something that interested them both. She thought about what it meant to build something, and how the thing you build is not always the thing you planned for, and how the best things sometimes begin with someone making an impossible stand on a dusty street and deciding without hesitation that what is right is worth the cost of defending it. "Then stay," she said. He came around the counter, because they had long since established that he was allowed to do that, and he stood next to her with James between them, examining a tin of crackers with serious attention, and the morning continued around them, and the town went about its life, and in the store that had survived everything that had been thrown against it, the woman who had built it and the man who had helped her keep it stood together in the ordinary miracle of a life well made. In the years that followed, Caldwell grew into a proper town with a proper school, which both James and Catherine attended with the earnest intensity of children whose parents had communicated, by example rather than instruction, that the world was worth understanding and effort was worth making. Helen expanded the store again and took on 2 young employees, training them in the precise and honest way she did everything, because she believed that how you conducted commerce was a statement about how you believed the world should work. Ralph served as Marshal of Caldwell through the remainder of the 1880s and into the 1890s, long enough to see the roughest chapter of the frontier close and the quieter, more complex chapter of settled community begin. He was offered a higher position in Topeka twice and declined both times, because Caldwell was where his life was, and he was, above all, a man who knew what he had. In 1892, they built a house, a proper house, on a lot east of Main Street where the residential streets were spreading, with a porch on the south side that caught the afternoon sun and a garden that Helen grew into something remarkable through sheer will, and the systematic application of agricultural knowledge she acquired from every book and pamphlet available on the subject. Ralph built shelves for the house the way he'd built everything in their life together, carefully, solidly, designed to last. James, at 8 years old, developed a passionate interest in the law that his parents found both predictable and deeply gratifying. Catherine, at 5, developed a passionate interest in medicine, specifically in the workings of Dr. Tolliver's practice, which she visited with such regularity that the doctor eventually began letting her observe examinations with a small, serious notebook in her hands. Helen watched her daughter watch everything with sharp eyes and thought, "Yes, that is right." On a December evening in 1892, with a fire going in the hearth of the house on East Street, and the children asleep upstairs and the wind moving across the Kansas plain outside, and the lamplight steady and warm within, Helen was at the table writing a letter to a supplier in Kansas City when she looked up and found Ralph watching her from his chair across the room, his book open in his lap but his eyes on her face. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about the morning I rode into Caldwell." She set down her pen. "What about it?" "I had no particular feeling about the posting," he said. "It was an assignment. I thought I'd serve the term and see what came next. And instead," she said, he looked at her with 10 years of their life in his eyes. "Instead, I met someone sweeping a front step who looked at me like she was filing an assessment, and I thought, that's an interesting woman. And then I found out she was right about everything she was right about and willing to fight for what was right and honest in a way that people aren't always honest. And I thought, that's the most interesting woman I've ever met." She looked at him across the lamplight room. "And then everything else," he said. She picked up her pen again because she was going to finish the letter, but she was smiling in the way she only smiled in private, the full version without any of the restraint she maintained in public. "You know," she said, "for a man who claimed his formal speech drafts were too long, that was a fairly adequate speech. 10 years gives you time to edit," he said. She laughed, which she did easily now, not because life had become simple but because she had learned through all of it that laughter and difficulty were not opposites, that joy was not the absence of hard things but something you built alongside them, brick by careful brick, in the company of someone who understood what building cost and what it was worth. Outside, the Kansas wind ran across the plain that stretched to every horizon. Inside, the fire was warm and the children were sleeping and the letter was half written and the lamps burned steady against the dark. She finished the letter. He turned a page of his book. The clock on the mantel marked the hour. In the town of Caldwell, which had been fought for and built and survived and grown, an ordinary evening proceeded in the warm and unremarkable way of lives that have found their footing and know where they stand. The eviction notice that had been torn in half on a cold October morning 10 years ago was long since dust, scattered by a prairie wind that didn't distinguish between paper and everything else the frontier eventually took from those who couldn't hold on. But what had been built in its place? The store, the case, the trust, the family, the life held firm against every wind that came, because it had been built by people who knew what they were doing and why it mattered and who, on the day it had mattered most, had chosen each other without hesitation and without reservation. That was enough. That was, in the full and honest accounting, exactly enough. And in the quiet of a winter evening in 1892, with 10 years behind them and everything ahead, it was also, by every measure that counted, more than enough. It was everything.